All right. Good morning, everybody. My name is Madeline Rodrigue, and I'm the Knowledge Mobilization Specialist here at Ontario Soil and Crop Improvement Association. Today, I'm joined by Paige Allen, Provincial Coordinator at the Ontario Soil Network. On behalf of OSCA and the Ontario Soil Network, thanks for joining us. We're really excited to dive into today's topic, and we hope you are too. This morning, you're going to hear from a couple of people who have either used or been involved with the AgriSuite tool in different capacities. The first one is James Dick, engineering specialist at OMAFRA, who has been involved in the development of these tools. James will provide a little bit of background on agricultural greenhouse gas emissions and the AgriSuite tool. Then you'll hear from Norm Lamothe, who farms not too far from Peterborough, and Norm is no stranger to trying new things on his farm and figuring out what works. Norm will walk you through an example of how he's used the tool to calculate the impact of his farm practices. A couple of housekeeping notes before we get started. If you have any questions, please share them in the chat box. And we can try to address them throughout the presentation, but there'll also be an opportunity to ask some questions at the end. And secondly, if you have joined today's webinar as a knowledge sharing event or a KSE, and you're joining because you have an on-farm climate action fund application, we'll be sharing some instructions on how to verify your participation towards the end of the webinar. So with that, I am going to turn it over to James to talk about emissions and AgriSuite.
Thanks, Madeline. I'll be short and sweet because I want to make sure we get to the main event, which is Norm. But I'm going to give you a brief overview of greenhouse gases in agriculture and the AgriSuite tool before Norm walks us through his farm, which he's modeled in AgriSuite. So why are we here talking about greenhouse gases in agriculture? Well, there's a lot of different sources for greenhouse gases in agriculture. As you're kind of seeing represented in this graphic, that comes from the soils, the soil carbon, the fertilizers we use and manure, the emissions from the equipment that we use, soil respiration, biomass, both growth and harvest. And so there's lots of different ways that greenhouse gases, and in particular carbon, cycles in the natural environment. And this is natural and expected, but it's really difficult to quantify and understand. So that's why that's one of the drivers behind the AgriSuite greenhouse gas tool that we're going to talk a bit more about today, is we really wanted to help farmers understand what do greenhouse gases look like on their farms? What is that picture of how greenhouse gases are moving? We get a lot of questions around that. I mean, there's been lots of media buzz and discussions about greenhouse gases and their impact on climate. So, we wanted to help farmers be able to get a picture of what does that actually mean for their farms. Not saying it's a bad thing or a good thing, it's just a thing, but we wanted to be able to help you as growers be able to quantify that. Now, there's three main greenhouse gases that we deal with in agriculture, and they are carbon dioxide, which is the one everyone talks about, methane, and nitrous oxide. So carbon dioxide is the main one everyone talks about. It is all around us. We hear about it all the time. And really, it's measured as the baseline. So if anyone talks about greenhouse gases, you hear them talk about quantities or tons of greenhouse gases, they're talking about carbon dioxide. And in fact, in the scientific world, we use a measure called the CO2 equivalence. So if you ever see CO2 with a little e written, that means everything's been quantified in terms of carbon dioxide, because you can actually relate different greenhouse gases to carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide, by definition, is one, it's the standard. But then the other two that we work in agriculture, methane and nitrous oxide, you can compare them to carbon dioxide. So if we look at methane, 1 ton of methane emissions is the same as 28 tons of carbon dioxide. So in a way, methane for the same volume of emissions is 28 times worse. Methane is primarily coming from manure and livestock, like digestion, enteric emissions. And then nitrous oxide, which is the one primarily coming from our use of fertilizers, that one's actually 265 times stronger than carbon dioxide from a greenhouse gas perspective. So this is why fertilizers have often been in in the forefront of the discussions around agricultural greenhouse gases, because the impacts of nitrous oxide are very significant. But 1 ton of carbon dioxide can be tough to wrap your head around because you can't see it. It's not like a gallon of water that you can visualize in front of you. Carbon dioxide is a gas. It's all around us. It's in the environment. Obviously, as a mass, 1 ton is equal to 1,000 kilograms or 1,000,000 grams. If you think of it in terms of a volume of the gas, you've got a grain bin that's about 28 feet high and 30 feet in diameter. That's the volume that 1 ton of CO2 gas takes up at atmospheric pressure, or roughly the same volume as about 400 tons of corn. So you can kind of get that picture in your head. And then if you relate it to fuel consumption, when you burn fuel, you get in its ideal form, you get water and CO2 as the byproducts. So on the right-hand side, you can see there's different fuels. And in particular, diesel fuel, which is one we use a lot on our farms, is about 100 gallons of diesel fuel is equal to about 1 ton of CO2. So think about how many times you refill your diesel tank on your farm and how many gallons that represents. You can figure out about how many tons of carbon dioxide are being produced from consuming that diesel fuel. Now, just to sort of step back a bit, Ontario overall, I mean, we produce a lot of emissions in a year. This was 2021's emissions. It's 150 million tons or megatons. And you can see that agriculture is about 8% of that. There's a small part of the energy and the stationary combustion. And then there is a large portion that's agriculture, which is soils, livestock, and manure. Now, if we look at only the CO2 part of those emissions, it's about 84% of Ontario's emissions are generated as CO2, most of that from burning fuels. Agriculture just is a small percentage. If we look at methane, it's only about 8% of Ontario's emissions are methane, but agriculture is about 1/3 of that. And then nitrous oxide is about 5% of Ontario's emissions, and agriculture has the vast share of that. Now, these quantities are all in relation to CO2, so these are all CO2 equivalent. But in terms of that, so the actual amount of methane and nitrous oxide we're producing is much smaller. But again, you have to add those multipliers in there, and that's where you get to this 5 and 8%. So you can see that agriculture has a big contribution for those. Then there's a few other greenhouse gases that are mostly industrial, and we're not going to worry about those today. If we look at only the agricultural greenhouse gases, it's about 12 megatons, just over 12 million tons a year produced in Ontario in 2021. And it's kind of broken down like that. And if you further break it down, the nitrous oxide is largely soils and a bit of manure. The methane is all manure and livestock and enteric fermentation, and then the CO2 is really the fuels that we're using for transportation and heating, basically. Now that's the 2021 breakdown. If we look at 2005, you can see that in the 16 intervening years, we've actually gone up by about 4% compared to 2005. That's a bit of a problem because 2005, if you're familiar at all with greenhouse gas reporting, the federal government has set a target that by 2030, across all industries, they're hoping to achieve a 40 to 45% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions compared to 2005. So we've gone up in agriculture 4% since 2005. So we've got about 44% to drop. And then by 2050, the federal government has set a target of net zero, which means essentially overall no emissions. Now, that doesn't mean zero emissions. It means that if we are emitting, we have to then be offsetting by additional sequestration. So um, storing carbon somehow. Now that seems like a really tall order because to be able to reduce that amount, there's a lot of things that may need to happen and it might have significant impact on our production. So if we look at how much we need to reduce, 40% below 2005 emissions, about 5 megatons or 5 million tons a year in Ontario. Well, the good news is that there was a study done in 2021 that looked at all different types of natural climate solutions, so environmental-based solutions, and they found that by incorporating a number of best management practices, we can get there and more. A large amount of that involves adding trees and preserving our grasslands. It also involves things like cover crops, better nutrient management, and things like that. So the bottom line is it's not going to be easy, but best management practices can get us there. And then 2050, obviously, to get to net zero, we're talking over 12 megatons a year of reduction. But if we do manage to plant a lot of trees and restore some of our forest cover, by 2050, we can actually achieve that. So it's not that this is going to be easy. It's not going to be free, but it is possible. And this is why we built AgriSuite, because we wanted farmers like yourselves to be able to understand the power of BMPs on your own farms. So what you'll find in AgriSuite, and Norm's going to walk you through this, is you'll be able to model your farm, and then you'll be able to choose a number of different BMPs that you can actually include, and it'll give you estimates of the impact of that on your farm. Just quickly to run over how we built AgriSuite. So we pulled a number of different data sources. We started with the International Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change for the United Nations, their guidelines on national GHG inventories, as well as international engineering standards. Now, Canada produces reports every year for the United Nations on our greenhouse gases and incorporates specific methodologies. So we've incorporated that as well. On the Ontario level, we incorporated regional weather and climate data in collaboration with Environment Climate Change Canada, University of Guelph researchers like Claudia Wagner-Riddle, Ontario's production specialist, industry experts, and then looked at the latest scientific information, particularly around BMPs and how those get incorporated on farms. So if any of you have questions on that, I'm happy to get into more details on that, but I'm going to leave it for now. Now, when we talk about AgriSuite, we're really looking at the boundary of the farm. So we're talking about crops, we're talking about livestock and manure management and energy use for heating systems, so barns, greenhouses, and grain dryers. We do incorporate a little bit on the fuel side and fertilizer and herbicide as far as their use on farm and the amount of fuel that it's taking to incorporate those. But we're not getting into the broader supply chain. So we're not dealing with transportation emissions for your farm products outside the farm gate. We're not dealing with life cycle analysis of your farm equipment. So this is not a life cycle analysis tool. This is a tool designed to give you a picture of what your emissions are at a point in time from your production practices. And then, as I mentioned, a key feature is the best management practices. So in the three categories of livestock, fields, and buildings, you can see that for livestock, the BMPs that you can incorporate are focused on how you're feeding your livestock and then how you're managing that manure. When it comes to the fields, we're talking about your fertilizer use, how you're doing that, and the rates you're using, and then what kind of carbon storage practices like reducing tillage, planting cover crops or trees. And then when it comes to heating systems, it's looking at things like insulation, your heating system type, and different practices that can help reduce energy use. So that's just a quick flyover of what you're going to see in the tool. And I'm going to turn it over now, just in a minute. Just a couple of caveats first. It is a tool designed for educational purposes, so it's not going to It's not designed for, as I mentioned, life cycle analysis, verification, or reporting. It's going to give you an idea in the right ballpark of where your emissions are, but it's not, there's a lot of assumptions in the back end. It's not going to be something that is going to be necessarily as accurate as if you did a full detailed study of your own farm, because there's obviously a lot of variability in our farms. And at the level we're doing in the tool, you tell us, what's your soil type for that particular field. Whereas we all know that, it can get a lot more detailed than that. So it's really useful for comparing different BMPs. We're going to continue to update this tool as new science and findings emerge. And even so, there's a lot of uncertainty in some of these categories. So that's just kind of what you're seeing displayed here. But it hopefully continues to be a useful tool for farmers. And now I'm going to turn it over to Norm and let him take it away. But I think first, there might be a poll question or two to jump into. But thanks, everyone. I'm happy to take questions later on. Or Paige, I don't know if there's any questions that we can grab now.
No questions yet, but I will let you know if something comes up, James. Thanks.
Okay.
Yeah, I just threw a poll in the chat, just trying to get a sense of how many folks in the line have used AgriSuite or maybe have used AgriSuite, but not the greenhouse gas emission tool, or just haven't tried it yet. That will probably help us shape Norm's presentation a little bit better and go see how much detail to go into. But if anyone is interested in using the tool, there was a link to use AgriSuite in the reminder email that went out yesterday. So you can find that pretty easily afterwards if you want to explore it.
Thanks. And Madeline, I do just see a question somebody sent me directly in the chat, so I'm going to address it. The question is, when there's a technology that reduces emissions from certain traditional practices, is there a way we can input our technology into the tool? So that's a great question. Right now, the answer is not directly. You're limited to the choices that we have in the tool. We don't have an option to incorporate like a custom practice, but it's a great idea and something we can definitely look at including in the future. As I mentioned, we do want to continue developing this, and we recognize that there's lots of people trying lots of different things. So looking at a way to input a custom option is a great idea. So thanks for that comment.
Okay, Norm, do you want to take it over?
Absolutely. Thanks so much, James, for that little bit of background on AgriSuite and how it came to be and how some of those calculations are done. I certainly learned a little bit from that, and I'm here today to share my journey on using this tool as a producer. This picture that you see in the background here is a picture of our farm standing on top of our large silo. We farm in the beautiful rolling hills of Cavan, Ontario, just outside of Peterborough. We've been on this land here since 1902. I'm a sixth-generation farmer local to this area, and for about 35 years we were a sow operation, so about 900 sow hog operation, basically from farrow to weaner, and we ended the hog production about 10 years ago, and I've since transitioned into what would be much more of a traditional farm in a 500-acre diverse operation. So cash crop is really what pays the bills here on the farm. We farm corn, soy, wheat, oats, as well as a little bit of barley. And we also have a small market garden. We have forages, so a lot of our land is covered. We do a little bit of hay for the horse industry. We have woodlots throughout our properties, as well as grasslands. Most recently, we've added a compost facility about 4 years ago, and that's helped us increase our organic amendments on the farm. And in 2020, we also built a passive solar greenhouse. Last year, we entered the livestock space. We added a small flock of sheep, and we've subsequently grown that to about 100 breeding ewes now. And for 40 years, my in-laws, mom and dad, have been producing organic maple syrup here on the farm. So our journey into soil health and soil health initiatives sort of started at the time when I was thinking of transitioning into the farm. Back in 2015, you see a picture of my son there on the left. This is the Soil Your Undies program that the Ontario Soil and Crop Association was launching at that time. And really, for me, it was a bit of an eye-opener. It was a dry summer. The crops weren't doing great. My soil seemed what I would consider to be sort of tired and really tough. And yeah, this program sort of opened up my inquisitive mind as to what's going on underground and what we could do to help mitigate some of the challenges that we were facing. I felt like we weren't growing crops to the maybe county average, and wanted to do more to improve soil health. For about 30 years, we were in a 2-crop rotation with the hog operation, corn, soybeans, and this was an opportunity for us to start to look at how we could improve soil matters. One of the things we discovered was, or one of the things that was not really known to me, was how much variability existed in our soils. And the map that you see there in the middle is a picture of an NDVI map that was flown from a drone. And it's not a very large field, but you can see there's just a tremendous amount of variability throughout that space, and really in all of our fields. So we started looking at different ways that we can manage that. And in speaking to the folks at Ontario Soil and Crop and their on-farm program, we were accepted into that research program, again, where we're looking at different management practices, rotations, off-farm amendments, cover crops, and how we can incorporate those into our day-to-day operations to improve the soil health. For us, soil health and managing soil health really starts with knowing what your baseline data points are. And so everything that we do and all the decisions that we make on the farm are driven by what we find in our soil tests. And to quote Peter Johnson, you know, as farmers and as an industry, we're kind of indefensible when it comes to some of these best management practices and greenhouse gas emissions if we can't justify the reasons why we're doing things on the farm. And not to preach that to the folks in the crowd here, but we really do need to pay more attention to what we're doing in our fields. And the easiest way to do that is to take some soil samples. On our farm, we soil every 4 years. So we have a 4-crop rotation, and within those cycles, we draw cores from GPS recorded locations. And the map that you see there on the right is what we call a site-specific soil map. And that's based off of yield data, some drone imagery, satellite imagery, and just our own knowledge of that land, including things like terrain. And then we go to those same points every 4 years to measure the trends of our soil data and make decisions related to that, and variable rate apply some of our products. As I mentioned, we are a research farm. I joke sometimes that our farm's a sandbox for a lot of cool researchers and organizations that want to learn from it. And this is the slide that we see here is just an example of one of our field days. We've got Ted down there in the soil pit, and we've got Don and his team out there walking in a fairly great crop of oats. And really, it's an opportunity for us to learn from the researchers, but it's also an opportunity for us to share some of the knowledge that we've gained through this journey with other producers in the province. So the philosophies on our farm are really focused on these items that you see here. Increased rotations. So we went from that 2-crop rotation. We added wheat was the first crop that we added back in, and then we subsequently added oats here about 4 years ago. Minimum tillage, and I do put an asterisk next to that. We are primarily no-tillers, but there are circumstances where we need to manage residues. We need to, repair things like ruts in the field, and we will get out some tillage tools for that. We're seeing some challenges with fertilizer stratification in our no-till system, so there's opportunities there to mitigate some of that with tillage. We do use cover crops quite extensively on our farm. 3 of the 4 rotations get a cover crop. So our cereals typically will get a red clover, and we'll put a multi-species mix if we don't get a good catch. And then we also cover crop interseeding our corn as well. Nitrogen management's probably the one that we've spent the most amount of time on in the last few years. And again, that variable rate nitrogen, split applying nitrogen in our cereal and our corn crops certainly has helped us not only save money, but has helped us reduce our emissions as well. Organic amendments plays a big role. We do some biosolids, some mushroom compost, as well as the compost that we make here on our farm. I'll show you some pictures of that here shortly. And with the addition of our new flock of sheep, rotational grazing. So we move our sheep every 4 days through both pasture areas as well as cover cropped areas. And in the off season, they're in crop residue areas. We feed them right out in the field. They stay outside year round and have access to areas that they can roam in and forage for those cover crops that are under the snow as well. I'm just going to take a quick moment just to pause for some questions. Are there any questions, Paige, that came up?
None in the chat yet, but just to remind people that if you do have questions throughout, feel free to throw them in the chat, and we're happy to take a pause and answer if you have anything come up.
Yeah, I'm happy to answer questions as we go through this, folks. So just post them in the chat and Paige will flag me. So we're here today to talk a little bit about the AgriSuite platform and how we've used it here on our farm. So James gave a great introduction on what the platform is and how it came to be. And I'll actually walk through you step by step what we did on our farm so that you can see the benefits of using the tool and how we went about it, the exercise here on our farm. So when you open up the website, agrisuite.omafra.gov.on.ca, this is the page that you see here. And so if you've already got an account, you can sign into your account. And if you don't have an account, then all you need to do is create one. And AgriSuite's actually a compilation of many different tools. Some of these tools have been around for quite some time. You can do things like field boundaries, you can do nutrient assessments, but the one that we're really focused on here today is this one here, the greenhouse gas emissions tool.
Yeah, and Norm, I'll just quickly jump in here. Anybody who works with probably a certified crop advisor or PAG, or who's done any sort of like NASM planning or anything like that, probably has actually seen some of their farm information put through AgriSuite before, whether they were super aware of that or not.
And I know a lot of crop consultants use AgriSuite in the background as well to do things like nutrient removal and different nutrient programs as well. Yeah, so once you click on one of those buttons, you sign in, and then this brings you to sort of a landing page. And you can see your previous, anything that you've done in the past, or you can also create a new project from this space.
Hey, Norm, I'm just going to jump in. There's a question in the chat for you.
Yeah, for sure.
What do you use as the X variable in varying the N within field application rates?
We've been doing a lot of nitrate testing here over the last couple of years, and that seems to be the best tool for in-season nitrogen management. We sort of start with a baseline based on crop removal and the yield targets that we have. Because we're splitting our nitrogen in most of our crops, we are using the crop condition at the time of the second application to determine whether or not we're going to that full rate, above that rate, or below that rate based on seasonal weather conditions. But nitrate testing seems to be the most reliable tool for us to use in season. Yeah, so if you are starting from scratch in the AgriSuite tool, when you click Create New, you'll get this pop-up box. And this is where you get the entire list of all the AgriSuite tools. And then you would just go ahead and click on the greenhouse gas emissions tool to take you to the next step. And that'll open up this landing page specific for the greenhouse tool. And here you have basically three main areas that the AgriSuite tool is looking to gather data from you with. So you have livestock, fields, and buildings. And you can enter data for, say, livestock, either by clicking the tab at the top, or you can click the little plus sign over on the far left-hand side there as well. As I mentioned, we have livestock on our farm now. This is our flock of sheep. They're primarily Katahdins and Barbados black belly. They're rotationally grazed, so every 4 days we move them. We move their pasture around. We have approximately 80 breeding ewes and some rams in the flock currently, and we started with 25 back in 2022. As you can see, the sheep there on the right-hand side, that's actually their where they currently are here today. It was a harvested soybean field. And believe it or not, they're quite interested in the soybean stubble. and we're gradually moving them back to an area of corn stubble where they'll reside for the winter time. Here's a picture of some sheep grazing some cover crops. This field actually gets planted to corn here in early 2023, and you can actually see our composting operation in the background there as well. There's some lambs in this cover crop that are hidden from the tall grasses. We generally like to leave green material in our fields 11.5 months out of the year, and we'll graze, or our plan is to graze the majority of those cover crops ahead of planting corn moving forward. So in order to calculate what the greenhouse emissions are from each of these variables, you have to go through the pages here sort of step by step. So under the livestock page, this is the landing page that you get to, and you pretty much fill out the boxes and the drop down menus. And one of the things that I found with this tool that was really nice is that it is very intuitive. It's a step by step. At different sections or different segments, there's drop down boxes. There's boxes that you can check if there's something you don't have the answer to. There's a details box that'll help explain why certain things are happening in the background, and it is quite easy to use from that perspective. So here we have Norm Sheep. We're located in Peterborough County. We're going to click on the livestock button. So if you have a single type of livestock, like in our case where it's just sheep, you can click on that. If you have multiple or combination livestock, you would click on the second option there. And that'll open up a new page. And again, here, you're just basically filling out the form the way the program is asking you to. You give it a name, you choose the type of livestock that you have. And out of the drop-down menus, a lot of thought has gone into all the different types of livestock and the different types of manure that are generated from those livestock. And although you don't see it changing here in real time on the right-hand side, every change that you make within the program will regenerate the greenhouse gas emissions or the equivalents. And that's kind of fun or neat in a way, because you can go back and play with those numbers and change those parameters, and then you're really able to see which ones are having the biggest impact on your bottom line. So our sheep are smaller breed, so they average about 80 pounds. We've got about 100 of them in the flock now. We did have an average of about 1.5. And we don't have any manure, liquid manure generated. I would say we probably have 20% solid manure in a nighttime yard where they are in the winter time. But the majority of the manure that's generated from this flock are in pasture. And then this is just the second half of that same page. And this is just talking a little bit about manure storage. And at the bottom of each of these practices, there's a little toggle switch that you can click that says specify mitigation practices. And this is where the BMPs come into effect. So when you click that little toggle switch, it'll open up a new window, and it allows you to check off boxes to see if you're doing some best management practices. And again, each one of those will change the calculation and adjust it accordingly. So in our case, we're just solid composting any manure that's in the yard, and the rest of it's on pasture. And once that happens, or as you're going through, it's constantly adjusting. But in this example here, I'm just showing you that we started with a baseline of 0, and when we're done the exercise, it spits out our number for us. And so for our flock of 100 sheep, we're generating 70.3 tons of CO2 equivalents. And what's really interesting here is that James was talking about the methane and how it's 28 times more than a typical CO2 emissions, but the equivalent is calculated using that factor. And so the sheep, even though it's only 100 sheep in our flock and they're all pretty small, we're generating over 70 tons of CO2 equivalents from that. And that was a real eye-opener for me. The first time I used this tool was in the winter of 23 to factor in my 2022 values, and I was quite surprised by how much emissions were generated from the flock of sheep, even though it was quite small. And again, once that report is generated, you can click on the little details button, and what'll pop up is where those CO2 emissions or CO2 equivalents are coming from. And here you see the CH4 enteric, which is the methane production, and the majority of the emissions are coming from the methane that the sheep generate, primarily through their excrement and manure production. Are there any questions, Paige, before I move on to the fields and the records there?
None from the chat, but maybe just, oh, hang on. One just came in. Further to the soil nitrate testing, I believe that OMAFRA has only calibrated this test for minimal N application rate at planting time. Is this what you do, or do you apply more N early and then use your own calibration algorithm?
Yeah, thanks for that, Terry. We do apply a little bit of N at planting time, and then we send our nitrate tests away to lab for analysis. And then based on the ppm results that come back from that, we will reapply or apply additional N based on the circumstances. This past year, we did some work using mushroom compost and some of our own compost in some fields. And what we found is we had quite good nitrate testing coming back from the labs, to the point where most of our wheat fields did not get a second application of nitrogen, as there was enough N available in the soil for the remainder of that crop cycle. I see Kathleen's just posted a question there as well regarding the enteric CO2 equivalents, and that might be a question for James a little bit later.
I can jump in now if you want, Norm.
Yeah, go for it, James.
Yeah, no, it's a great question, Kathleen, and you're right. Things are in a cycle. The grass does remove CO2 from the atmosphere as it grows. The sheep do eat the grass and emit the CO2. They emit the carbon in the form of methane, which is in a different form. So although the grass is actually uptaking the excuse me, uptaking carbon in the form of soil carbon or CO2, like the methane that the livestock emits doesn't directly convert into CO2. It does go into the atmosphere, and then it stays there until it breaks down into further parts, and that takes quite a while with methane. So it is a cycle. But it's a little bit different when the livestock are eating it as compared to biomass. Like if you grow a crop, which Norm's going to get into the field section next, when you grow your crop, let's say a wheat crop, and then you harvest it, and whether you remove the straw or not, that straw decomposes and turns back into carbon, and the carbon dioxide that's emitted through the decomposition. So that's more the direct carbon cycling. When it's consumed by the animal, it actually gets converted into methane, and then the methane is emitted. And so methane doesn't cycle the same way. It does go into the atmosphere, and it will break down over time. But it stays there. It does stay in the atmosphere quite a long time and does create potential impacts for greenhouse gases and the greenhouse gas effect. So that is why we include it. Happy to chat more about that later, because I don't want to derail Norm's presentation here. But these things are complicated. We understand that, and there's no way we can incorporate every linkage here within this tool. But the bottom line is there is a concern with enteric emissions from livestock, and so ways that we can manage that, or ways that we can manage the methane that's being emitted from manure, does provide a positive benefit. Back to you, Norm.
Yeah, thanks, James. And the complexity of what goes on in the background is very, like James said, it's very difficult to measure all of the different factors. I think what this tool does a really great job of is giving you an overview from primarily the livestock and crop production side of things, and allows you to play with it so that you can see where you can reduce your own greenhouse gas emissions and determine how close you can get to that net zero target. I'm going to go through the field section now, which is probably the most relevant and probably the most complex and has the most steps of all all the three options that we have at the top here. And I won't go through every one of my crops, but I'll show you how I set it up and give you a brief overview of our results. So you click on the field section, and then what it asks you to do is put in your farm name and start to name your fields. And for us, rather than going through every single field, we just blocked our crops together. So if we had 100 acres of corn, we just called the field corn. We're using pretty standard practices in all our cornfields. And so it just became a lot easier to manage rather than going through each of the individual fields. In our area here, we have fields that are 3 and 4 acres in size, and it would take an awful long time. And just to give everyone a bit of perspective on how long it takes to use the tool, or how long it took me to use the tool, at a 500-acre farm with 4 crops, livestock, and a few buildings, I would say you could complete this task in under 2 hours to go through everything and do it quite thoroughly. So it's not that time consuming, and the results are certainly beneficial for determining what you can manage on the farm. So again, here, pretty intuitive on how we fill out these forms. You put in your farm name, your municipality, the township that you're located in, the geo township. As I mentioned, rather than doing individual fields, I just called this field corn. Total tillable acres of the corn that we planted here this year was 130. The area for material that we're spreading on is 130. There's a standard slope of 7%. If you don't know what the slope is in your area, it'll ask you what type of soil you have. And then there's this button called Add Field Input. And when you click on that, there's 4 different things that you can add to this program. One is the crop, so corn in this case. Add crop rotation. You can actually tell the program what crops you have in your rotation, and I assume that there's a calculation related to the GHGs that have a factor there. You can add a material application, and what material applications are things like organic amendments, manures, things of that sort. And then there's fertilizer application, and that could be your dry fertilizer or your liquid fertilizer. And so we're going to go ahead and go through the cropping portion of that right now. And so when you click on that, it pops up another field, and then you indicate what the crop is. In our case, it's corn, which is a grain. And then we put a yield estimate in here of 150 bushels. And as you're putting these data points in, on the left-hand side there where you see production recommendation, nitrogen N, those numbers will start to change. So it'll give you a ballpark figure of how much nitrogen you should be applying for that crop in your area, and you can adjust accordingly. Approximate planting date, approximate harvest date. You put your tillage practices in there. In our case, it's no-till. And you can put your price of corn in, as well as the price of nitrogen, and then your end fertilizer timing. And so this is where we would put side dress in. And then as you can see here, it'll spit out a production recommendation. So it's recommending 91 pounds of nitrogen based on probably the factoring some of the pricing indications in there, but also the yield targets. And then the estimated soil erosion is probably based on the slope there. So next on the field input side, it'll ask for your crop rotation. And when you click on that, it'll open up another window. Now there's a variety of pre-populated rotations in this drop-down menu. And if you don't see the one that you're doing in your area, all you have to do is click on the custom rotation, which is at the bottom of the list. And in our case, the rotation that we have on our farm isn't in the list. So we clicked on that, and that pops up another menu for us. And all you have to do here is choose the number of crops that you have in that rotation, and how long you've been doing that rotation as well. And then you click the add button at the bottom. And so as you can see here for us, we've got corn, soybeans, oats, and wheat. And that's our typical 4 crop rotation. As I mentioned earlier, some of these off-farm amendments that we do here on our farm. So we do receive biosolids from the local municipality. We have mushroom compost that we've been bringing in here for a couple of years, and we also do a little bit of biochar production on our farm as well. And our main organic amendment that we use is our own compost. So we have a contract with the local county and the municipality, and they deliver us their leaf and yard bag program. And then we convert that material into an organic compost. We generate approximately between 400 and 500 tons of this material a year, and that will cover anywhere between 40 and 50 acres of ground here on our farm. So to add those organic amendments into this tool, you click on the field input and choose Add Material Application. And this is where a lot of options pop up. There are some pre-populated items that you can place in here, or you can add your own materials as needed. So in our case, we've got biosolids and liquid application. We have the application dates. We do have a cover crop, so it's being placed on a cover crop most times. About 4,000 gallons to the acre. And then if you need to add a material type, so let's say our own compost that we have on the farm here, it doesn't meet sort of a standard nutrient value. We can do that by using the tools within the AgriSuite. And if you're placing manure and you're not sure what the analysis is, it's incredible how many different options there already are pre-populated in the tool. And when you choose, say, bison manure, chicken manure, chinchilla manure, it will automatically pre-populate what an average composition of those manures are from a nutrient standpoint. And that'll help you factor in the greenhouse gas emissions from that. So if you don't have your own analysis, like I said, choose one of the materials that maybe best resembles it. And in our case, we have lab analysis from the compost material. So you can choose other from that list as well. And under that source, you would put your lab information in. So the values and the percentages and the ppms can all be entered in manually as well. And that allows you to use the calculator tool to the most effective way possible. As I mentioned earlier, we are quite extensive users of cover crops. We started just by broadcasting our cover crops into standing corn. You see our little Ford 4000 there with just a 3-point hitch spreader on the back of it. Our cereals get a red clover cover crop. And if the red clover doesn't take, then we usually go in with a multi-species mix. So we'll throw some oats in there. We'll usually throw crimson clover, tillage radish, and another legume. And in our corn stands, we'll put a cereal rye or an oat as a grass, and then we'll also generally put peas, a tillage radish, and a crimson clover in that mix as well as hairy vetch on most occasions. We like to leave our cover crops over winter. We think that green material and living root structures for the microbes is important. It does create some management challenges come springtime ahead of the subsequent crop in a no-till practice. But we've managed to figure out some techniques that work for us in delaying our planting dates to allow those crops to be terminated in a timely fashion. Here's just some examples of the cover crops. You can see in the corn crop here on the right-hand side, there's a fair bit of ground cover there and some nice tillage radishes. We also have some marginal areas that we've planted out into pollinator gardens. This is just an example here on the right-hand side. Again, promoting that diversity and promoting those living root structures year-round, we found to be very beneficial from a cropping standpoint. Our red clover is broadcast into our standing grains. So on our wheat, we'll broadcast red clover on frost with a fertilizer application. And in our oats, we broadcast our fertilizer ahead of the oat crop, and then we subsequently plant directly into it. We have a no-till drill that has some wavy coulters on the front, and that does a nice job of just gently incorporating some of those cover crop seeds. On the left-hand side, you see a note field here that's partially harvested, and the red clover is a good crop this year and coming through. And then on the right-hand side there, you see what that red clover looks like after it's pushed through the oat straw and is doing quite well. We'll terminate that red clover ahead of planting wheat into that field, and that has been generally quite successful for us in our rotations. And we see about a 25% nitrogen credit from that red clover to the subsequent crop, which is typically corn following wheat. So as I mentioned earlier, at the bottom of all of those pages, there's a toggle switch called Specify Mitigation Practices. And this is where we would enter information related to our best management practices, cover crops, rotations, things of that sort. So under the cropping cycle, if we click that toggle switch, a whole bunch of these mitigation practices pop up, and we can enter information that's specific to our farm, and that will go into the calculation of the greenhouse gas tool. So in our case, it's no-till. In corn, we reduce our nitrogen by 20% through a variety of factors. Partial credit for the nitrogen coming out of the red clover, but also our rotations and our best management practices, compost, etc. We do use nitrification inhibitors in our liquid nitrogen. We've been doing that for a couple of years now, and have found that to be beneficial from an economic standpoint, as well as a greenhouse gas emission standpoint. None of our fertilizers incorporated. It's all broadcast or streamed on the surface. We do try to manage that by placing it ahead of a rain, especially when it comes to liquid nitrogen and side dress timing. We do have mixed legume cover crops in our corn, legume, red clover in our oats, legume, red clover in our wheat, and we don't have any in our soybeans, but we do have it in our corn. And so this is just looking at a 5-year cycle of those practices. Here's another example of our cover cropping practices. So this is a blue jet that we converted to a nitrogen streamer, as well as a cover crop seeder. So we took off the coulters, the injection coulters that were on the blue jet. We added on these Y-drop systems. And then ahead of that, we placed an APV cover crop seeding unit, and that is a flat rate. We set the pounds on the cover crop seeder, but the blue jet is a variable rate applicator. So we can use visual data that we have going through the field. We can use where that crop is in the cropping cycle based on the weather conditions of that season. We've used drone data to tabulate areas of good plant health and poor plant health. And we were able to take that information, place it into the monitor in the cab of the tractor, and through GPS, we can variable rate that fertility throughout the field. And we're limited to timing with this unit just based on the height of the corn crop. But typically we can get in about as far as 7 or 8 leaf corn, and that gets us sort of into that middle to late June timeframe. And really that's when that uptake for the nitrogen starts to happen in the corn cycle. Are there any questions in the chat page that came up?
Not yet, Norm, you're good.
Okay, perfect. And then the last button on the cropping cycle is the field input. So this is where you would put in under the field input, this is where you would put in your fertilizer applications. And these are primarily your dry and your liquid fertilizer applications. And they're also pre-populated in there so that you can choose the products that you're using. Or if you have a custom blend, then you can also go in and place whichever percentages you have of the variety of nutrients that you're using. And so this is where you would click on the fertilizers toggle. And once you did that, it would ask you more information about that application. And in my case, we generally do blends based off of our soil sampling data. And so the standard numbers that are in AgriSuite don't necessarily function for what we're doing. So we would click on enter nutrients applied as actual pounds of each of those nutrients. And then you click the add product button. And when you do that, the nitrogen, phosphorus, and potash boxes pop up automatically. And if you see the little green box there that says add a secondary or micronutrient, when you click on that, you have the option of choosing other products. And then here you just basically enter in the actual pounds of each of the nutrients that you apply. We don't generally apply phosphorus on any of our fields. 35 years of hog production and a heavy program of off-farm amendments provide us with ample phosphorus. But we do find ourselves quite low in magnesium and sulfur in our area. So every trip across the field with the fertilizer spreader gets a little bit of sulfur and some magnesium as well. And so that takes us to the end of the cropping function. And again, we start with a baseline of 0, and the program's constantly updating as you're going through each of those steps. And so for us at the end of this exercise, we went from 0 tons. Oh, sorry, you have to enter the current cropping tillage practices and how long you've been doing that. And then once you've done that, again, sorry, you can specify mitigation practices. And here again is an opportunity to talk about some of the things that you're doing on their farm that will help reduce your greenhouse gas emissions. If you haven't already done this in the previous step. And yeah, so for us, this was a big surprise for us. We thought that through all of the practices and all of the fertilizer use and the different things we were doing in growing that crop that we would have a positive CO2 equivalent. And we actually ended up with a negative CO2 equivalent. And that had to do with land use calculations and the crop that's growing there, but it also had to do with a lot of the best management practices. And as we played around with reducing our nitrogen, adding the denitrification inhibitors, etc., we found that a lot of the CO2 emissions came down through those practices. Cover cropping, rotations, all of those things contributed to reducing the overall gas emissions.
Norm, it's James. Can I just jump in here quick? So if you go back to your last slide where you showed the negatives, when you and I recognize that right now this isn't super clear in the tool, but because the tool is producing an emission number, when you actually see that negative, it does actually mean that you're storing carbon. So your 3.1 there as a baseline means that even at a baseline level, you're storing 3 tons of carbon a year or CO2 equivalent. And then after you add those mitigation practices, you're upwards of almost 50 tons a year. So you are in a positive balance here, even though it's a negative number, because if it was a positive number, you'd have that would be an emission. So I recognize maybe there's an opportunity to make that a little clearer here, but that's what it means.
Perfect, thanks. And so I'm not going to show you all of our crops. I showed it for corn, but we have 5 crops essentially. If you factor in our hay pastures as well, we have about 50 acres of hay and grassland areas. And similarly, we manage those just like we would a regular crop. And then we have our oats as well. About 80 acres of those were planted here in 23. We have our soybeans, about 130 acres here, as well as our winter wheat, about 120 acres. And so each of those have their own management practices. Nitrogen reduced in winter wheat. Again, it follows a oat crop with a smaller clover crop. And so we've managed to reduce our nitrogen needs there a little bit as well. So once you're done all of that, oh, sorry, we're gonna just go through the buildings as well. This is the third piece. And again, this just factors in some of the energy consumption used in the farm buildings itself. None of the in this program accounts for things like the home or any of the other factors, but certainly the farm buildings, barns, greenhouses are all within the tool itself. So in our case, we would just add a building. It does factor in drying greenhouse gas emissions as well. So we have a drying bin, we have a stirrator here on the farm, and you just fill out the information that's required. just go back to that again. Yeah, so we have a batch dryer stirrator. We typically dry in November and December. Our fuel type is propane. It talks about how many tons you're drying and where your moisture is when you start and finish. And based off of that, it'll give you a calculation for how much greenhouse gas equivalents that you've emitted. Similarly, you can add a barn, and in our case, it's a shop. It's a 3,000 square foot shop that we heat through the winter months. And it'll ask you questions about whether or not the floor is heated, foundation's insulated, the building has an attic, how many stories, etc. And yeah, pretty self-explanatory. And so once all that's done, you get to click on the report button, and that populates all three of those fields together to give you a summary of where your greenhouse gas emissions are. And so this is the baseline report of the total emissions created from the operations. And so here you see the livestock system, you see the fields by the different crops that are grown, and you see the buildings based on the inputs that we put in. And so in our case, there's 137 tons of total emissions created. And as you can see, approximately half of those CO2 equivalents come from the small 100 flock sheep. And then the second half of that report is the greenhouse gas mitigation piece. And this is the, and maybe James, you would like to speak to this a little bit of what the mitigation report means and how those offsets are tabulated.
Sure. So in the mitigation side, what we're really looking at is what's the difference that you've made compared to your baseline. And so as you can see here, kind of broken down for each input, like the livestock system, he's only got one, his sheep, but then his different fields. It shows you the impact for each of those fields. And along the top, you can see the different greenhouse gases that we're considering: methane, nitrous oxide, and carbon dioxide, both from land use and energy. So what you're seeing on the mitigation side is, like on the baseline, you saw the totals from baseline. Mitigation one is the totals after you've incorporated all those best measurement practices. So then comparing the two, you get your net value, which is the amount that you've actually changed. And I think that's represented elsewhere on the report as well, to see like the total reduction that you've achieved. So the mitigation is like your picture after you've included all those BMPs. Where is your farm at?
Is there a report that shows like mitigation by BMP?
Yes, if you look at that report, if you go back one slide there, by BMP. No, unfortunately there's not, because how some of the BMPs are calculated, it changes, like the calculations are enmeshed within the entire algorithm. So it's not as though you have your baseline and then it has the, you change one factor, and then so the best way to get that is you'd have to input the BMPs individually, or sequentially, I guess, to see, okay, first I'm going to add this BMP and see what the change is, and then I'm going to add this one. What it produces, the mitigation is just like the picture after you've included all the BMPs that you've selected. It just, unfortunately, the way the calculation works, it's very difficult to extract from some of the BMPs. It's very difficult to extract the input specific to that BMP when you've incorporated multiple BMPs. I do understand why would be a useful piece of information for folks, and it's something in the future we can look at, perhaps if there's a way to incorporate that better. But right now, it just kind of gives you the before and after picture. So to identify the impact of an individual BMP, you have to kind of only select that BMP and then do the comparison for that one alone. Hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah, and I can speak to that a little bit as well. Like, because it's always auto-populating and repopulating every time you toggle a switch or you drop a menu item or check a box. If you do want to see what the values are for those, you can go back and forth and looking at your final result. Some things have a much bigger impact than others, and you have to do multiple BMTs to really see that impact take effect on your bottom line. But one of the things that jumped out at me for sure was the livestock. We looked at the cropping cycle and what the totals were in 2022, and I was blown away by what impact the livestock had on that number, and also just the nitrogen use. And you can play with how many pounds of nitrogen you're applying on your crop, and you'll see that bottom line changes quite substantially as you decrease or increase the nitrogen number. And so those are really the two that jumped out at me the most. And just the land use as well. So you can see here on the land use CO2 equivalents. There's a lot of I guess from the mitigation standpoint happening just from growing those crops in the field or growing the hay in the pasture that affect the bottom line as well. So on our farm, we've got a goal related to our climate legacy, and that's really reducing our carbon footprint as much as we can. Tools like AgriSuite help us in evaluating what areas need to be improved or what practices have an impact on that bottom line. We're on a journey to net negative through carbon sequestration and growing crops sustainably. And our goal here on the farm is to electrify as much as we can. We have a solar installation going up this fall. We just purchased an electric car this past summer. And the picture that you see there on the right is an electric tractor, which we're still hoping to receive here in the spring of 2024 to test on the farm. Anything that we can do to help reduce our footprint is something that we're interested in. Being environmentally sustainable and profitable is a balance that we're constantly trying to figure out. But we're certainly been on that path now for a few years, and we feel like it's possible to do both. So in 2022, the first time we used this tool was in 2023, using our 2022 values. And we just had a much smaller flock of sheep at that time. Our field practices were not what they were in 2023, but we used the tool to help guide some of those decisions that led us to some of those better management practices in 2023. So overall, we generated or had a net positive of 24.1 CO2 equivalents. And we're trying to figure out how we could incorporate more best management practices to get that number down. So in 2023, we went through the exercise, and these are the numbers from the last two tables that we saw in those slides. And so we were, total emissions of 137.5 and emissions reductions from practices and land use of 168.3 gets us to that net negative of 30.7 tons of CO2 equivalents. So overall, the tool for us has been very beneficial at helping us evaluate where our emissions are coming from and allowing us to create the opportunities to mitigate some of those through changing some of those practices. And I would just want to thank James and the crew at OMAFRA for putting that together. It's a simple tool, it's free to use, and I would strongly recommend that all producers take a couple hours out of their yearly schedule to put their inputs in and figure out where their greenhouse gas emissions are coming from. So I'm happy to answer any questions you might have, or if there's any other questions for James.
Maybe we'll give people a moment to throw things into the chat. But Norm, I just have a quick question for you. Since doing the AgriSuite's tool for 2023, have you been able to identify kind of any low-hanging fruit or changes you might make going into 2024 to kind of alter those numbers that you're seeing from this year to next?
Yeah, I don't think we'll make many more changes in 24. So the big changes that we used or that we did in 23 were the nitrogen inhibitors, and that certainly had an impact, and we'll continue to use those. We've got most of the results back in from using that practice, and there were certainly some benefits economically from doing that. We've already got a pretty regimented cover cropping program, and so we can't really do much much more on that front. And with the 4 crops in the rotation, I think we're maxed out at what we can do from that standpoint. I would love to learn more about the emissions generated from the livestock and how rotational grazing from a sequestration standpoint has an impact longer term. And I 100% realize that's a really difficult calculation to come up with. But yeah, there's things that we're doing there that we're mitigating that are maybe not being completely reflected in the outputs.
Yeah, that's a great point, Norm. I mean, at the moment, you noticed, obviously, there's a bit of a disconnect between the livestock tool and the fields tool, in that if you're creating a pasture, for example, you can't assign livestock to that pasture and graze them. So that is one gap. There's other gaps in the tools that hopefully over time we can fill those gaps. But rotational grazing and incorporation of more pasture side practices onto the crops tool or the fields tool is definitely an area of interest for us to improve the tool.
For sure. And in our case too, I realize we're unique with our composting operation and how we use those nutrients in the soil. And there's a sequestration component to that process as well that we can't, I don't think, account for with the tool. But as a baseline tool to use for producers, it's great.
And I will just note to attendees as well, I put this in the chat too, but if you are using the greenhouse gas tool, you'll find that there's a tab in there as well called resources. Under that tool, there's a number of links that include additional information like background on different practices. We're going to be adding soon a backgrounder on the tool itself with a bit more detail on some of the methodology behind it. And then as well, my contact information, as well as a few of my colleagues, is listed there as well. So if you are working through the tool and you have questions or not sure what's going on, you can get in touch with us that way, and we'd be happy to answer questions.
Madeline, do you maybe want to give people the opportunity to unmute themselves if they want to ask questions directly to either James or Norm?
Yeah, I believe that should be an option now. So if somebody maybe has a more complex question or wants to talk a little bit about their own experience with AgriSuite or a question they have about their own farm, feel free to unmute yourself and ask your question. I do see that another question just came in the chat too.
Yeah, so I can address that one. Our new features expected for the tool, decision-making features to play out different scenarios, looking at BMPs and cost share. Yeah, absolutely. We are hoping to add new features like that, recognizing that right now there really isn't the economic side captured in the tool. So, you don't have the ability to put in, say, fertilizer prices or things like that to help you assess whether or not it makes sense from an economic standpoint. That's something we'd like to add in the future. Additional BMPs, being able to better compare different scenarios. The cost share analysis is an interesting one. Like if you put in something and say, okay, if I get paid for this at 35% or whatever it is through, through the sustainable cap programming, does this make sense economically? So yeah, right now that ability isn't in there. You'd have to kind of extract the data through the report, and it would show you the like Norm's, like you saw from Norm, it would show you the impact of the GHGs and then how that would influence. It also the tool doesn't account for say agronomic impacts. So if you expect like a yield change from adjusting your fertilizer practices, the tool won't automatically calculate that. You could adjust that within the tool, but some of that is not as automatic as perhaps it could be. So there's a ton of opportunities for improving this tool. We'd love to include them all. we'll do the best we can over time. You won't see it change right away, but over time, we definitely intend to continue to update and further develop this tool to be more useful for farmers. And I guess that's another pitch to reach out to us when you do use it, play around with it. If you have feedback like that, let us know. Send me an email because my contact info is in the resources tab, and let me know what features would be useful to you, because that helps us better make the business case for adding those features to the tool and spending the time to develop it. So we really do value that feedback a lot.
Well, if feel free to ask any questions in the chat or jump in if you have any. But in the meantime, I think Paige is going to share a couple of exciting things going on at OSN. And then following that, I'll talk a little bit about KSE participation shortly.
Thanks so much, Madeline. Perfect. Okay, so hi everyone, I'm Paige. I'm with the Ontario Soil Network. We are a peer-led organization of farmers across Ontario, which are focused on improving soils by connecting and supporting farmers, and Norm is one of our wonderful members. So we do have our 2024 Network Challenge coming up. So applications are currently open until December 31st. Our Network Challenge is a one-year commitment which provides participants the opportunity to enhance both your soil health and your professional network. It's a 6-part workshop series with lots of opportunity to collaborate with your peers across Ontario, get mentorship and training, develop your skill set, along with a platform to share your ideas and your best management practices. So if this sounds like something that is interesting or beneficial to you, please feel free to use the QR code to apply. We'd love to have you join us. And just a reminder that applications are closing December 31st, but also happy to take any questions if people have those later on. And then for the Innovative Farmers Association of Ontario, we have our conference coming up February 21st and 22nd in Kitchener, Ontario this year, and we'd love to see you there. The focus for this year's conference is the Future Ready Farm, so navigating technology, sustainability, and profit. It's going to be an immersive experience to explore the intersection of technology, sustainability, and profitability in modern agriculture, with lots of deep dives and discussions into future fuels, agrobotics, and the evolving best practices for farming businesses. You can get all the details at our website at ifao.com, or again, if you want to scan the QR code, you can directly purchase tickets there. But yeah, thanks so much, Madeline, for the opportunity to share.
No problem. And before we move on, I just want to take an opportunity to thank Norm and James for all of their time today and in preparation for today's webinar, for sharing their experience and expertise with this tool and with their own farm. It's a really busy time of year. Norm is actually finishing corn today. Congratulations. And so to take a step away from those busy activities to share with everyone here, we couldn't be more grateful, and of all the steps that you take to promote best management practices across the province. We really appreciate it. And to James for sharing your knowledge and the background information on the tool and offering to be a resource for people moving forward who want to learn more. So thank you very much. Greatly appreciate it. And I'm sure both of you would be willing to chat with anyone on the line anytime if they have questions or anything like that in the future.
Absolutely. Thanks again for this.
Yeah.